Okay. Hi, I'm Greg Ayotte. I'm the Director of Consumer Services with the Brain Injury Association of America, and I am here today with three esteemed members of the Brain Injury Association Advisory Council. So we have Darcy, Kellie, and Kaz, all joining us this morning to talk a little bit about advocacy, what it means, why it's important, and how to get involved. So we'll start with Darcy. Tell me a little bit about kind of how you got involved with advocacy and what it means to you.
So how I got involved with advocacy is I got asked actually to testify at the Indiana State House. My injury was as part of an auto accident. So there was a new seatbelt law coming out, and because I've told my story to several folks, they're like, "Hey, it should be great to talk at the State House." So actually, I was asked to do that, and it was at first a little intimidating because I was like, "What do I have to say that's important?" But I
Mm.
but I also realized, you know what, my story is important to the legislative issue. So I think just by having somebody ask me, hey, you know what, your story is important, I think that would be very helpful in passing or supporting the legislation. That was a big deal to me and was very important to me to make sure that my story was heard and validated.
So your efforts to kind of educate others, telling your story, someone else connected the dots and said, wait a minute, that story kind of puts to the point about this legislation, kind of reached out. And so that's really, so your advocacy kind of came about as part of the result of your education efforts, like, right? Going out, telling your story, sharing more about brain injury, that you just never know where those stories go, who hears them, and how they see that story might be used to help others.
Mhm.
That's
Yes,
fantastic.
you summed it up very well, Greg.
Well, good. All right, let's go to Kaz. Tell us a little bit about your kind of experience with advocacy and how you got involved.
Okay, I got involved in advocacy because sometime after my accident that I sustained the brain injury, I came across the Brain Injury Alliance of Arizona's Unmasking Brain Injury event. And so I
Yeah.
attended that, and just in telling my story there, it was similar to Darcy. They were like, well, would you be willing to come to events and speak about your experience? Prior to the accident, I was a wellness professional, and so I had done some speaking and holding classes and things like that. So it was a natural transition. It was scary for me at first because I wasn't really prepared to share that aspect of what I had gone through personally. But the more I did it, going to the speaking engagements, going to our local advocacy days, it just kind of became something that I knew that I wanted to get more involved in. And so from there, I ended up doing other events and planning different events and coordination efforts and going into speaking through advocacy.
That's fantastic. You just never know. You never know, right? When you start talking and sharing you just never know where it's going to lead. So it's scary and exciting all at the same time.
Um,
All right, Kellie, tell us about your experiences.
All right, so mine was a little different. I definitely am still nervous about, sharing, my personal story, and definitely intimidated by sort of the legislations or speaking in front of, important events or anything like that. Even though that is my main message, we all don't have to be intimidated by that because it's actually way more approachable than you may think. But I started doing it. I sort of had my own little blog where I would, write about different treatments I was doing for my brain injury symptoms, and then through that, I started getting connected to other events where I sort of went the route of interpreting some like medical information or interviewing doctors and trying to like break it down on a patient level. So that's where I think I like the advocacy route for me is more in that realm. And yeah, I just think it's really important that advocacy sounds really important and sounds like it's sort of, or that was wrong. Advocacy is very important. It sounds very specific, and I always thought it was only legislation and everything. But
Yeah,
even just telling your story to someone you run into in the street, or reaching out, or really just spreading the word about anything is advocacy. Advocacy is so broad, and there's so many venues for so many people to get involved with whatever you're comfortable with.
that's a really good point. That the as you guys have all kind of said, none of you started out saying, I'm going to be an advocate. I'm going to go do legislative. Like that was not the intent. The intent was more education and awareness and understanding. And that kind of rolled into, hey, we should talk about some of the legislative stuff that impacts people with brain injury, their access to service, or what might be available, or more research, whatever it might be. So it's a natural transition, I think, for folks to that are willing to go out and share a little bit about their story. They eventually get asked to say, hey, could you talk about this in relation to, right, this piece of legislation or this funding or something like that. So it can be scary because if anyone has read actual legislation, it's a totally different language and it can feel very intimidating. And I think a lot of the part of the advocacy for you guys, it's not to be legislative experts, right?
Mhm.
You're the experts in the lived experience, as they say, right? It's the no, this is what actually happens, after an injury. This is the experiences we have. Here are some things that can be helpful. And so it's not it's it's being able to help connect the dots for legislators about the impact of the legislation on people's lives,
I
which
agree, Greg. I think that the legislation, we as individuals who've experienced brain injury, we bring that to life. We bring a face to what the issue is. So
Mhm.
that's why I think, yeah, it's very important because we can, yeah, put a name, a face on something that had happened.
So are there things that for folks that are interested in kind of getting involved in this, are there tips or strategies or things to be mindful of as somebody starts that journey? And we'll start this time with Kellie. We'll go reverse order. We'll go with Kellie first.
I think, yeah, sort of just going off of what Darcy was saying, don't be intimidated. It sounds so terrifying and putting yourself out there. And yeah, like the legislation that Greg was talking about, I still don't understand it. And I actually attended the awareness day at Capitol Hill for 2 years before I even went to any of the meetings because I was so like I felt so underprepared or like underskilled, and I had no idea that all I had to do was, tell my story really quickly and make it, put a face to really get um, these people to care about it. Um, Sorry, I got
That's
got
good. No,
a little derailed there.
that's a great answer. It's true. It's you don't have to be an expert. Just showing up makes a difference. Sharing your story makes a difference.
And I think I also saw when you start getting involved in line, you see or online, you see a couple of, the same faces over and over. So you feel so intimidated because you're like, oh, they must have been doing this, for decades. They must know
Right.
so much.
Yeah.
And once you start to get to know them, so many people want to help you. They're not intimidating, and you have just as much of a right to be in the space as everyone else. And we want that. Like everyone in the advocacy sphere wants more advocates. So please reach out and please know that we all want to help you and we all want you on board.
Excellent. All right, Kaz.
I would say one tip is to figure out what kind of advocacy works for you. Just like we've had three different
Yeah, I do.
stories here sharing with you today, it could look like whatever you're most comfortable with. It could be letter writing, it could be social media posts, it could be getting involved at your state level. So just like each brain injury is individualized, so is your form of advocacy. And so you don't have to try to follow in anyone's footsteps necessarily or do it the way that you think that it should be done. Find out what way works for you. And then also I would say for someone who was apprehensive, myself beginning to get involved with advocacy, is to just go for it. There's never going to be a time where you feel brave enough. There's never going to be a time that's perfect. So even if you start out small, just try to find a way to just go for it. And it'll get easier and easier as you continue on your journey of advocacy.
Perfect answer. That's
That's a
what I
great
was trying.
answer. Yeah,
Yes,
what she
love
said. That's a great answer. Just do it. Just go for it.
that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Darcy.
So how do I follow that?
I know, right? Yeah.
I, but what Kath had mentioned, absolutely. Find how or what works for you. What worked for me was once I started this advocacy, I then reached out and looked on the state's website saying, hey, you know what, here's the bills that might be of interest to me, or talk to local association or your local or your state's affiliate to find out, hey, what bills or what things are we looking at for this upcoming session. You know, just if you can reach out to someone, or maybe even talk about it in your support group to find out what matters. Because in the end, advocacy is helping us live better lives. It's helping us get our word out about our injury and educating people. So that way new laws can be formed around that. Because having educated legislators who have the ability to write things to help us live better lives is what's key here. So whatever advocacy avenue is good for you, but just get started and don't be intimidated by it. When I was asked to speak in the legislature, I was very intimidated because it was in front of a packed house. And what made it even worse was that when I signed in, it was either you signed in for a bill or against the bill. Of course, I signed up for the bill. So they went through those against speaking, and then they went for the ones that were speaking for the bill. So after everybody had talked about for the bill, my name hadn't been called yet. So when the Speaker of the House said he wanted to move on, I stood up in front of everybody and I said, Senator Weiss, I filled out a paper to speak. So, and it shushed the whole entire Senate
Oh,
floor,
yeah.
which freaked me out, but it's important. I mean, that was intimidating, but the thing is that he thanked me, you know, for doing that. He said, thank you so much, because he knew my story was key to the bill being passed. So
Mhm.
no matter what, our stories are key. No matter what avenue we select, as Kaz mentioned, it's your story is important. So let it be heard and just continue on.
Great story. That's a
It's
nice way to
amazing.
wrap things up. Yeah.
I
So I'm gonna
was scared.
end. I'll end with a few like practical things for folks to think about. So as they are doing if they're planning visit or doing whatever with legislators, um, practice telling your story. You're trying to do it within just a couple of minutes, right? So you want to give like the headlines, the highlights of kind of what your experience has been. Not so much that you're in the weeds and you have so much info that the person can't follow all you're saying, but not so little that they don't get a flavor of really what your experience has been. So that's a lot of work. That is not an easy thing to do. So I would encourage folks, if they're looking to kind of advocate for whatever legislation is, practice telling your story, trying to get it down to a couple of minutes. If you can, try to tie the legislation to something from your experience. So something that you experience that you think the legislature might have been helpful for you, that's all you have to do is say, wow, this legislation would do this, and that would have been really helpful for me, early on after my injury. That's it. That's all you have to do. That's connecting the story to the legislation. That's another way to be an effective advocate. Um, yeah, you don't need to be a legislative expert. And if you can't physically come to Awareness Day, so we're having our Awareness Day in DC. If you can't physically come, there are still ways to participate. So you can still visit your legislator in their home state office. You can still, send emails or send letters to their offices in support of the legislation. So every voice counts, no matter how it's sent, whether it's email or in person. Like, all of those things help to show that there's a groundswell of support for the legislation. So don't feel like if you can't physically be in DC, there's no other way to participate. There are certainly other ways to participate. And be on the lookout for more uh, videos and recordings from BIA, walking through the legislation, walking through kind of the logistics of being in DC, and more tips on kind of becoming an advocate, being an advocate, and sharing your story. So my part is done. I thank you all so much for joining me today and kind of sharing a little bit about kind of your stories and how you got started. I think it's an important message for folks to hear, that you kind of, you all had different kind of paths to becoming advocates, but they all started with learning how to tell your story, kind of sharing and getting out there. And as Kaz said, just go for it. Just go for it. I like that. So thank you all for coming and sharing today. Um, as always, if folks have questions or are looking for additional info, you are always welcome to contact the Brain Injury Association of America. You can go on our website, biausa.org. You could call our helpline, 800-444-6443, and speak to a specialist. All right. Thanks, everybody.